and how to split them. First, what are user stories? An user story is an unit requirement written in business language that can be developed, tested, and delivers tangible value to end user. I have highlighted the key terms in this definition in a different color. So let's go through them quickly. A unit requirement, which means that an user story is an independent unit that can be developed without relation to any other parts of the development in the application. Second, it's written in a business language, which means the user story is better written by a business user or the customer. It can be developed and tested, which means it's feasible, and delivers tangible value to end user, meaning an end user should be able to explain what he or she gets out of a user story. Here is an example. So as a ground handling agent who works in the airport, I want the flights in watch list to move to a departed section so that I know they are departed. So this is talking about an application that they are using to view the flights. So as you can see this, a user story follows a specific format, but it's not a rule, okay, but it's a preferred format. So here, as you can see, it starts with as a user. In this case, the user is a ground handling agent. What the user tries to do, I want the flights in watch list to move to a departed section. And what does the user get out of it? So that they know, or the user knows that the flights are departed. So though this is not a strict format, it is a common industry format used to write user stories. In addition, an user story contains a description, a little bit more detail about what is needed from the story, acceptance criteria, which list down the criteria that must be met for the user story to be accepted and put in production, estimation, which gives how big is the user story in terms of development effort, and the priority in relation to the other stories that are on the plate. There are three reasons why we have to split user stories. Let's go through them one by one. Reason number one, if the user story is too big, it gets difficult to prioritize. Let's take this case. Out of these two, which do you think is easy to prioritize? Is it two stories, one of 30 days and another 20 days? Or it is the two stories split into 5, each with an estimate of less than 10 days? In the first set, as you can see, there is not enough room to play around. Okay, so either you do both the stories or you do story 1 or story 2. It's very difficult to accommodate or difficult to prioritize these stories in the first case. So it gets easy to prioritize by splitting the user stories. Reason number 2, with bigger stories, the plan becomes very rigid. A typical sprint velocity is around 40 to 50 ideal days. By velocity, I mean what is the amount of work that the team can achieve in a given iteration. So given this 40 to 50 days average, if you have two stories with 30 or 20 days of effort, so again the scenario is similar. So you either can do both the stories or you can do story 1 or story 2. So there is no real way to play around or make your plan a bit more flexible. But if these stories are split, or if the stories are smaller in size, it gives you a lot of freedom to play around with the stories within your iteration, and the plan becomes more flexible. This is the second reason. And the third reason, the estimation inaccuracy increases with size. If the user story is too big and you give it to your team members to estimate, chances are very high that they come up with a rough estimate, or the estimate is far from accuracy. Let's take this example. So let's say you have a house, okay, and you are asking your builder for a quote or an estimate to build the house. If the builder is just going to look at the whole plan or your vision of the house, and he can say that he will build a house in 1 year, Okay, chances are high that he may not be able to meet the target because it is not split, it is not well defined, so he doesn't talk about the different steps in constructing the house, and it's more a ballpark figure. But if you can split the activity into various parts, say getting the foundation done and finishing the living room, kitchen, toilets one by one, and finally painting and furniture and so on, the estimation accuracy increases because the builder or whoever is going to give you the estimation can look at the fine detail of things and give you a reasonable or a better estimate. So this is the third reason why I say that splitting user stories is really helpful. So now we have seen how to or why to split user stories. We can see some ways how to split them. Strategy 1. Along the data boundaries. Split based on the interfaces A, B, and C. Here A, B, C are external systems. And the other story can be based on the information coming from interfaces D, E, F. Or you can make further splits. It can not be just 2, but it can be 4 or 5. But what I want you to focus on is a strategy where you split along the data boundaries. Strategy number 2. Separate exception and error handling. Okay, so normally the user stories get sometimes too big because we try to cover every possible error handling in the first implementation. Though it is perfect and ideal, it's not always required. So it is another strategy where you can have the core functionality and the essential error handling in the first user story, and the good to have or the additional error handling in the other story. For example, here I talk about a story where the user can enter flight details and save them, and all the validation must be performed and errors displayed. It can be further split into I can enter flight details and save them, let's say with basic validation, and the second story can be the advanced validation or the good to have validation can be in a separate story, which based on priority may be pushed later. This is strategy number 2. Strategy number 3 is based on the operations performed. So let's say that you're writing a user story which covers every possible operation that you can think of related to the functionality. It can be a good idea to split these operations into 2 or more stories so that the story becomes easy to maintain or manage. Here is an example. So the initial story says the user can view all the details and edit, save all the fields that are enabled. So possibly you can split the story. One way of splitting the story is the first story can be about viewing all the details, and the second story can be about editing or saving fields that are enabled. Okay, this is just an example. Strategy number 4 is similar to the previous strategy. So where typically any screen that you are going to develop or any module that you're going to develop will have 4 basic operations, which we call as CRUD operations, which stands for create, view, update, and delete. Okay, so one way is to maybe split this core CRUD functionality into 2 or more stories. Here is an example. So the first split, I talk about viewing the information, and the second split I'm talking about updating and deleting the information. Okay, so this is another strategy which is pretty much in line with the previous one where we talk about splitting the operations. And strategy number 5. So there is always a possibility to split the story based on functional and non-functional requirements. A functional requirement is something that is directly visible to the business, but a non-functional requirement is something not visible but essential for the application to run. For example, a performance requirement is a non-functional requirement. Here, as you can see, the initial story says that the result of the computation must be displayed within 10 seconds. Okay, so here we combine the implementation of the functionality as well as the non-functional requirement into a single story. Potentially, this can be split into 2, where the first one talks about implementing the functionality where the computation results are displayed, and the second one about the performance requirement where it is displayed within 10 seconds. Okay, this is one way, but keep in mind this may not be always possible, because in some cases the end users don't see the value of a functional story without some non-functional requirements. So make sure you agree with the customers or the business representatives before splitting the user stories this way. Okay. And the last one, strategy number 6 that I'm going to talk about is you can potentially split stories into sub stories or smaller stories which may have different priorities. Okay, so for example, I may have a story, as I mentioned here, where the user wants to generate a report but also be able to print it. Okay, so maybe the viewing the report is the highest priority while printing it is of a lower priority. Okay, so this way you can split the story into two, one to create the report and the other to print the report. And depending on the priority of the second story, this may either be done immediately or done later, depending on the other things on the plate with the team. Okay, so to summarize what we have discussed so far,